columnist Jim Saft. Today we had the second to last U.S. non-farm number before the election, a crucial piece of data, and actually it wasn't all that bad. The unemployment rate dropped to a near four-year low of 7.8% in September, and that was supported in some way by an increase in the participation rate. A survey of households showed 873,000 jobs gained in the month, which was the most since 1983. So it wasn't as bad as some people feared. It wasn't fantastic, perhaps didn't change real perceptions of the parabola of the economy. And we're here to discuss this today. We've got Josh Bivens, an economist from the Economic Policy Institute in Washington. And we also have Reuters' own Andy Sullivan, a political reporter who's been following the campaign. He's based in Washington as well. And I guess I'll go to Andy first, and I'll say, do you think this is enough to make a real difference in the election outcome?
No, I don't. And that's because these types of numbers are, we in the media and in markets love to focus on these types of numbers, but voters in general aren't following economic data like this that closely. While political scientists think that people often do vote based on the economy, they tend to take the larger picture into account, and so it's the sort of trend of the economy over the past year. If you look at GDP growth and personal income growth, that tends to line up with whether the incumbent stays in office or not. And right now that's pointing to, both of those things have been growing at like 2%, not great, but not terrible, and that points to a narrow victory for Obama in November.
So you wouldn't expect that this is, do you think this is going to change how they'll argue with one another? In other words,
yeah.
Is it?
Yeah, I mean, this will certainly play out in a couple news cycles. It'll lead to a burst of positive news coverage for Obama. We haven't seen the official reactions from the campaigns yet, but, I can guarantee you the Obama campaign is going to say, hey, this shows that the economy is moving in the right direction, that, things are not as good as they should be, but stick with me, and things will keep getting better over the next 4 years. That argument that Bill Clinton made in the convention, the economy is improving, you just don't feel it yet. For the Romney folks, it sort of takes away one of their arguments that, the president promised that the stimulus would put the unemployment rate below 8%, and it hasn't been below 8%. Now it's below 8%, so that's, one line they can't use anymore, but they can still beat them up plenty on the economy, and I imagine they will still do so.
Yeah, the 8%, I was thinking as soon as it came out that the 8%, going below 8% was, if not tremendously meaningful, at least extremely useful for the Obama campaign, that plays well.
But do you think that, honestly, there's any undecided voters out there saying, well, if the unemployment rate goes below 8%, I'm voting for Obama, otherwise I'm voting for the other guy? I don't think that's how people think.
Yeah, that's probably right. And and as you say, we're probably close enough to the election that if it actually shows a real underlying improvement in the economy, that's not really being felt by very many people at this point. And, it's not going to trickle down to people who aren't, as we are, looking on Twitter in the minutes after the non-farm numbers. Josh, what do you think about the numbers themselves and what they show about the economy?
I think they show not a lot of change. I think the decline in the unemployment rate that it showed was actually, I think it's misleadingly good. I don't think the fundamentals justify a 300 basis point drop in that. The payroll employment number, which tends to me to be the more reliable month-to-month number, that is just exactly on trend. We are growing somewhere between 100 to 150,000 jobs per month. We've been doing it for a long time. Some of the internals are a little better than trend. They revised up the previous 2 months employment counts, so we now gained 142,000 jobs last month instead of, I think we came in below 100 when it was initially reported. Hours are up a little bit, nominal wage growth ticked up a bit, and so, if you're willing to squint really hard and make a lawyer's brief, you can say there's a sign of an upward trend. I don't buy it until I see, 3 months or 4 months of it sustained, but there's definitely no sign of weakening. And I think this basically says the economy is continuing what it's largely done for the past year, which is steady growth, but growth that is really insufficient to really rapidly pull down the unemployment rate reliably.
Yeah. What do you think? There was the juxtaposition. The employment population ratio went up slightly, so that would tend to give some credence to the drop in the unemployment number. But on the other hand, you had all these people going into involuntary part-time work. where do you fall down on that? Which one do you place more emphasis on?
I think, what largely drove the decline in the unemployment rate was a very large registered job gain in the household survey. So, there's two surveys. There's the
Right.
survey of firm, the survey of people. When the employment number starts to diverge a lot in a given month between the establishment and the household survey, I buy the establishment survey. The household survey, the employment count month to month, it's pretty volatile. Over a long time, they tend to track each other. This is one of those months where they really got out of line. I think it was an 800,000 job gain in the household survey.
That's right.
That's not the trend job gain in the economy by any stretch. That'll come back to earth. And so we could actually see a higher payroll number next month and yet a rise in the unemployment rate as the household survey sort of regresses to the mean. So I am not putting a lot of weight on that big decline in unemployment. To me, I look at the establishment number. If I need a month-to-month read, that's the more reliable month-to-month read.
So overall, taking these numbers as a whole, what do they argue for in terms of policy? Let's talk about fiscal first, and then maybe we can do monetary.
To me, like I said, we're not circling the drain. We're continuing what we've been doing for the past year, but that past year has been growth that is totally insufficient to really pull down the unemployment rate. So to me, we still need, I would like to see more fiscal support. At a minimum, we should avoid severe fiscal contraction, which is, what current law has in store for us January 1st, unless something changes. So we won't get the fiscal support I want. I hope this means the fiscal policymakers will not slam on the brakes too hard as they negotiate over the fiscal cliff. And there's certainly no reason for the Fed to think, oh, we don't need to provide, QE3 for another couple of months at least. I mean, frankly, I think given how contractionary fiscal policy is going to be for a while, we're going to need supportive monetary policy for at least the next year, if not quite a bit longer.
I think the Fed is with you on that one. I believe that's their unstated analysis as well. So, Andy, what given what Josh has just said about the need for fiscal policy, and given your analysis that Obama continues on his path to a narrow victory, where do you think we come in terms of the fiscal cliff after the dust settles after the election? What's going to happen? Are they going to be able to reach some sort of an accommodation, or do you think we're looking at a real contraction in government spending next year?
Well, you're talking about Congress, so to assume any
Yes.
sort of basic competence or rational action would be probably a little bit optimistic.
Yeah.
Obviously, they need to do something, because otherwise we're going to have these tax increases and dramatic spending cuts that will really have a strong impact on the economy. But there's so many moving parts right now, you don't know who's going to be in the White House, you don't know who's going to control the Senate, and there's an outside chance that the House could flip as well. And so I think up on the Hill they're starting to have talks, but obviously I think nobody's going to be able to be in a position to make any firm agreements until after the election. One thing you hear about is people saying, let's just keep things as they are for another 6 months or so, and that'll give us time to work out a deal. But, they love giving themselves these deadlines and then sort of not really getting anything done anyhow. So I'd like to be optimistic, but
But you don't see necessarily a backlash of intransigence if the election goes the way you expect it to, that result. Well, I mean, of course, it depends on how the House and Senate fall. But do you see that as a threat, as a possibility, perhaps we should say?
If it turns out the way that it's looking, it might turn out narrow victory for Obama, Democrats narrowly hold on to the Senate, or maybe Republicans gain it narrowly. It's still basically a status quo election. You still have the Tea Party Republicans in control in the House and Obama in the White House. So they'll still be butting heads. So some people say maybe this time they'll actually come to some sort of grand bargain on the budget, but I think that's going to take a lot of hobnobbing for that to happen.
Yeah, I certainly don't think that equity markets are anticipating that there's going to be a grand bargain in the markets. I think instead they're probably betting on essentially what you say, pushing the can a little bit further down the road, but nothing dramatic happening on the fiscal front. And then the place in which they're getting their support is really from the Fed. And when I look at these numbers have been very well received, or at least they were when I stopped looking 10 minutes ago in financial markets. And that is probably not because financial markets are actually optimistic about America getting back to work and that being good for the value of their securities, but rather because it's going to keep the Fed on their current path of accommodation. And if you look at how markets have traded over the past several months, they've really, I would make the argument, many people disagree with me, that, stocks are above their fundamental value. And that is at least in part because the Fed is pushing so much money into the market. And some of that, and that's intended in part to get equities up and get people spending some of that money. This is going to keep the Fed on the track that they've enunciated they're going to be on, which is, rates very low for a very long time, continued accommodation, buying mortgages, and even I anticipate continuing the buying treasuries when that expires later this year. And that's really good for financial markets because we don't have employment falling out of bed. We don't have, the economy isn't circling the drain, but we've got that great support from the Fed, which, as they've said, could go on forever. I guess one thing that I observed that was interesting in the numbers is the composition of job gains. And it was a small number, but financial intermediation went up. And part of that was also people in real estate going up. And it's clearly probably too early for the Fed's buying of MBS to be having a big impact there. But, we're seeing really low interest rates for mortgage borrowers. And it may be that, we're going to get an improvement in that. What do you think, Josh? Is that possible? And also, my second question to that is that a good fundamental driver for the U.S. economy, an increase in the share of GDP to financial intermediation?
On the first one, I think there's a couple things going on. If you really, again, wanted to squint and try to find some good news in the past year in the overall economic numbers, I think you can make a case for housing. I think housing, the actual act of building homes, not just housing prices, has finally bottomed out. It's going to stop dragging on the economy. That's usually what leads recoveries. It sure has not led this one, but at least I think it's a dead weight off the economy, and so that's good. I think you could imagine a boost from the ultra low interest rates that are being engineered by QE3. We have to find some way to relieve the constraint of people who can't take advantage of those low interest rates for refi because they're, have loan to value ratios too high. And so that brings up the whole, Ed DeMarco at the FHA, who refuses to allow some of those rules to be modified so that people can do that. I think that's a real problem. We're blocking a key part of the transmission mechanism of those low interest rates helping the economy. I think if we can relieve that, that'd be good. I think one other thing, too, a question about markets, actually. There's this conventional wisdom among some policymakers that we will get a grand bargain on the budget when the bond market revolts and you start to see higher interest rates. And so that's what's going to force it. And I'm sort of wondering if people are, completely misreading it. I would think that markets would be almost more afraid of premature austerity than failure to get a grand bargain by January 1st. And so I think part of the rush to we must do this in the lame duck because that's when everyone feels free. And if we don't do it in the lame duck, we'll be downgraded and all that. It's not obvious to me at all that the imperative of the markets are going to work that way.
No, there are some people who I really respect who argue that were we to get an indication that we're going to get a really severe agreement in the budget, that actually you would see, it's just less money moving around the economy, and that money ends up in corporate tills, and that, ultimately justifies the value of an equity, right? That's what you're buying. And that you would get a big fall out of bed. Now, you do, though, obviously have the other alternative, which is, the mythical bond market. I could say the mythical bond market vigilantes, but in my rather long career, they did used to exist. At some point, may come back. But listen, you're not going to see signs of that with the Fed dominating the Treasury market in a way. The Treasury market is, and I'll make this the last point, then we got to wrap up. Treasury market is dominated by non-profit maximizing entities, right? The Fed, other global central banks, and people who are buying treasuries, at least in part because they're forced to because of rules for pension fund, the way that that's discounted. So you're not going to get a signal from the treasury market until the very last minute, and then it's going to be a massive signal. I'm not arguing that it's going to happen. It's a very small outside choice, but I don't think you'll observe that in a kind of day-to-day, week-to-week. It'll happen not little by little, but all of a sudden. Anyway, guys, thank you very much. Really interesting. I appreciate your help. Again, Andy Sullivan from our office, Werder's office in Washington, Josh Bevins from the Economic Policy Institute.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.